In this video, we will continue working with the authentication filter, and additionally to adding JSON Web Token to the response header, we will add user ID to the response header. So I have stopped my debugging and I will switch back to my Spring editor. And for me to be able to access user ID, I will need to somehow access the database. And for accessing database, we have a method in user service implementation. So I'll open up user service implementation, and I'm looking at my package structure here, and I don't see the package that holds the repositories. Here we go, user repository is inside of our root package. This is not nice, so let's move this into its own package, which is going to be under IO and then repositories. So I'll bring up menu, and then I will use refactor, and I'll choose move, and I'll create a new package, and that's going to be under IO repositories, like this, and click on finish. And now I will move this user repository into a repository package. I like to organize my classes into packages because as my application grows and I have more repositories and I have more interfaces, interface implementation, and more data access objects, I like that those classes are properly organized in its own packages. Okay, so let's go back to authentication filter. And for us to be able to access the service, user service implementation, we could auto wire it to authentication filter, but because authentication filter is not a bean, it's not being auto wired into our web security, but we are actually creating a new instance of it manually rather than auto wiring it or injecting into our web security. The authentication filter cannot auto wire or inject other beans, so we'll have to access application context and then instantiate that bean manually. And to be able to access Spring application context, I'll create a separate class under my root package, and that's going to be called Spring application context, and I'll click on finish, and I will copy and paste the code snippet that I have prepared. This is a very simple class. I gave it a name Spring application context, but it's very important that it has to implement application context aware interface. Let me import this one, and let me import application context from org Spring framework context, and let import bean exception. Here we go. So we've created a new class, we've called it Spring application context, and that class implements application context aware, and then it overrides the set application context method. We are then exposing one method here, which is getBean, and we will be calling this method and we will be giving a bean name so that it can return the already created by Spring framework bean. For example, when our user service implementation is created, when Spring Framework creates this bean for us, user service implementation, it will be available to us from that application context. And we can get access to this user service implementation from anywhere in our application if we have access to this Spring application context object. So what I'll do, I will copy user service implementation name, and then I'll go back to my authentication filter class. I'll scroll down to successful integration, and right under the token, I'll add a line of code which will use Spring application context to get user service implementation bean so that we can get user details. So because user service implementation class implements user service, I will need to use user service as data type. So I'll go back to authentication filter, user service equals, and now I will use Spring application context. This is the name of my Java class I have created here, Spring application context, and that Spring application context will have a static method which is called getBean. We have created that method in that class, and it needs to take a name of the bean. And the name of the bean will be user service implementation starting with the lowercase u. When user service implementation gets created by Spring Framework, the name of the bean will be the name of the class, but with the lowercase u. And this is why inside of my authentication filter, I'm getting that bean with the user service implementation lowercase u. Now I will import user service. And what I will also do, I will need to cast the bean to user service. Okay, so now I have my user service and I can use it to call its methods. For example, I could call create user or load user by username and then specify username. But the problem with the two methods that we have there is that none of them we can actually use. We cannot get user details using create user, and we cannot use load user by username because it returns as a different data type. If we go back to user service implementation, this method returns user details, and user details come from Spring Framework, and that will not contain the public ID of our user. That will return us a user object that contains email and password. We don't need that. So I'll need to create a new method, and it will work very similar to the methods that we have here, but it will return back user data transfer object. So I'll go to user service interface, and I'll add one more method here, which will return user data transfer object, and I will call it getUser. And we will get user by email address. And now I'll provide an implementation for this method. So I will go to user service implementation, and right here I will add override public. The data type is going to be user DTO, and I will provide implementation of this method, and it's going to be very simple. So first of all, we will need to call find by email from user repository, and once we have this entity, we will create a return value of user data transfer object data type, and then we will copy properties from user entity to a return value, and then we will return value like this. But we will also make sure that a user entity is not null, and we will copy this line of code which checks for user entity not being null like this. So if user entity is null, we will throw user not found exception. Okay, so now we can go back to our authentication filter, and inside of this authentication filter we can use user service to get user, and we can use email address to get that user, and we'll get back user DTO. And I will need to import user DTO, and this one is actually username, so let me copy username. And now once I have user DTO, I can get public user ID from that object. So I will add a new line of code here, response add header. The first argument will be the header name, and I will give it user ID, and the second argument is the value of user ID, and that will be get user ID. Okay, so now if we run this application and attempt to perform user authentication, we should be able to get back the JSON Web Token in the response header and user public ID added to our response header. So let's try this. I will run my application, and I will bring up Postman. Here we go, and I will simply repeat the existing HTTP post request that we have. So it's HTTP post to a /login, and we are providing email and password of the existing user. So I'm sending this request, and I get back 4 or 3 And the error message is null pointer exception in the Spring application context get bean. Okay, so we forgot to do one more thing. We've created Spring application context, but this Spring application context need to be available as a bean as well. So what we need to do, we need to copy its name and then go to our mobile app web service application, which has annotation Spring Boot application and the public static void main. And here we will need to add one more bean. And that bean will need to return Spring application context. And I'll do it like this. Return new Spring application context. Okay, so now once Spring application context is a bean, we will be able to access it in authentication filter and be able to get the user service implementation from it. Okay, so let's try one more time. I'll stop my application and run it again. Bring up my Postman and repeat this HTTP request. Okay, and this time I got back HTTP status 200, which is okay. And then we have the authorization header, which contains the JSON web token. And here's our user ID. Now we can use this user ID in our subsequent requests, for example, to get user ID details API call and then update user details API call or delete user details. We will always use this public user ID. Okay, so we have JSON web token and we have user ID and we can continue.